This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody.
Earlier this week, Florida federal judge Aileen Cannon threw out the criminal case that had charged former President Donald Trump with mishandling classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago estate. Judge Cannon is a Trump appointee, and several of her decisions on this case have earned her accusations of bias. Our first guest today, constitutional scholar Bruce Fein, will join us to explain Judge Cannon's ruling and how it represents a shocking departure from long-standing legal precedent. Also, we're going to look at a recent FTC ruling that child safety advocates say is a huge step in the right direction. Federal regulators have for the first time banned a digital platform from serving users under 18. The app, NGL, is a question and answer app that encourages young users to solicit anonymous messages from their social media friends and followers. In October, the child safety group Fairplay and parent activist Kristen Bride filed an FTC complaint urging the regulator to investigate allegations that NGL, which stands for Not Gonna Lie, illegally marketed itself to children using unfair and deceptive trade practices. Our second guest today will be Haley Hinkle, policy counsel at Fairplay. We'll speak to her about the details of the FTC's enforcement action, as well as its implications for other digital platforms that market to children. Finally, we welcome back friend of the show, the Nation's John Nichols. We'll talk to him about the recent open letter co-signed by 70 news organizations that asked Israel to allow journalists access to Gaza. He'll be coming to us from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where he's covering the Republican National Convention. We'll get his observations on the RNC and his recommendations for how the Democrats should conduct their own national convention later next month. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our incorruptible corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, Bruce Fein is back to dissect the Honorable Aileen Cannon's decision to dismiss the documents case against Donald Trump. David?
Bruce Fein is a constitutional scholar and international law expert. Mr. Fein was Associate Deputy Attorney General under Ronald Reagan and is the author of Constitutional Peril, The Life and Death Struggle for Our Constitution and Democracy, as well as American Empire Before the Fall. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Bruce Fein.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome back, Bruce. What we want you to talk about this Florida judge, this rogue Judge Cannon, who dismissed the espionage obstruction of justice indictment against Trump, overruling the Supreme Court's decision in Nixon versus the United States, and more than 50 years of practice in holding, as she wrote, special counsel Jack Smith as being illegally appointed by the Attorney General with no statutory authority. Our listeners should know that Judge Cannon is an inexperienced Trump nominee, and when she won the lottery to be the judge on the Just Farmer case against Trump, who purloined all kinds of classified secret documents and took him down to Mar-a-Lago after he left office, was advised by two of her colleagues to step aside. They saw she was inexperienced, probably knew she was pretty off the wall, and she refused. And she's been delaying and delaying the case, so now there's no chance of any trial, of course, and just a few days ago, she dismissed it. You object to that strenuously, and you've written an article on it. Explain it.
Yeah, several articles at this stage. I think that here, Ralph, a little brief history speaks volumes of logic. The modern special prosecutor you and I experienced directly during Watergate, it stemmed from the cover-up of the Watergate burglars' funding by the Republican National Committee to try to save Richard Nixon. And when the attorneys general, John Mitchell and Richard Kleindienst, had been convicted of crimes, a vacancy was there, and Richard Nixon nominated his Secretary of Defense, Elliot Richardson, Harvard Law graduate, whose professor at Harvard was Archibald Cox. And the Senate Judiciary Committee, then led by Sam Ervin of Watergate panel fame, insisted that they would never confirm Elliot Richardson unless he created special prosecutor and appointed Archibald Cox, because they could not trust the executive branch to investigate itself. Said that's the absence of separation of powers. You can't have the executive branch be a judge in its own case. So the purpose of the special prosecutor was to strengthen separation of powers by ending the absolute control that the president or attorney general would have over prosecutorial decisions. So Archibald Cox was appointed. Elliot Richardson was confirmed. He is doing his job as special prosecutor. Nixon forces him to be fired, not because he wasn't validly appointed, but because he allegedly was targeting Mr. Nixon. Then comes the successor to Elliot Richardson. Robert Bork was the acting attorney general. He insists that Leon Jaworski be appointed the successor. Leon Jaworski, among other things, sues Mr. Nixon for White House tapes he used in the cover-up trial against Nixon's colleagues, and he prevails in the U.S. Supreme Court. And among other things, the court goes out of its way to say Mr. Jaworski was appointed properly to cite relevant statutes, and he has standing to sue President Nixon. And that understanding of the Supreme Court's decision, which was in 1974, which is like 50 years ago, was understood to mean that special prosecutors are constitutional, especially because they fortify separation of powers rather than weaken it. We had kind of a temporary deviation during the independent counsel stage, where independent counsel was even stronger than special counsels because they were appointed by 3 judges, not by the attorney general. So Judge Cannon says, well, I can ignore the Nixon precedent because I'm trying to defend separation of powers. Now, if we pause for a second, Ralph, think how obtuse that is. Under Judge Cannon's ruling, the only people who can prosecute Trump are not an apolitical special prosecutor, but the attorney general or political people. Mr. Biden, now the attorney general, are the only people who can prosecute, which is saying that you're destroying separation of powers in the name of saving it. Everybody in the public obviously feels greater confidence that you have a special prosecutor like Jack Smith prosecuting and not someone who may have a political agenda. Attorney general is a political appointee, and president obviously is a political appointee. So the whole thing made no sense at all. To aggravate the obtuseness of the decision, while she decried the Nixon words issued by a unanimous 8-0 court in Nixon versus U.S. as dicta wasn't absolutely necessary to the case, she cites for 3 occasions Clarence Thomas's classic dicta, a solo concurring opinion in Trump versus U.S., where he kind of wanders off, although it's not in the case, and comments, hey, maybe Jack Smith wasn't properly appointed. So she cites dicta that she likes because it reads the result she wants, but the holding and the dicta she doesn't like, she just airbrushes out of the case.
Well, the Justice is going to appeal immediately to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals, who has rejected a decision by her early involving Trump and criticized her severely. But what do you think the chances are of her being overruled? And then will the Trump lawyers again appeal to the Supreme Court for more delay?
Well, Ralph, this is the 11th Circuit on that issue. And yes, the earlier decision very, very unusually, sharply and personally rebuked her for appointing a special master, to kind of chaperone the Justice Department's review of documents legitimately subpoenaed from Mr. Trump. They said, this has never been done before. This is crazy. And have said, basically, you were out on a frolic and don't do it again. So I think the likelihood of the 11th Circuit reversing this is close to 100%. And I believe at this stage, having wrapped her knuckles once, they'll just remove her and say, we can't trust you anymore. I do not believe that they will get any stay. They can seek review in the U.S. Supreme Court. But in my view, the court is a little bit gun shy after the Trump versus U.S. decision, and they don't want to have their fingerprints on this and will leave it alone. So I do think it'll get back. You're still correct, Ralph. There's no way this case, even restoring Jack Smith, is going to go to trial by November.
How about by January 20th, 2025?
No, I think there's a possibility that if you have a new judge and not the lead-footed Judge Cannon, they can put it on an accelerated basis, especially because they do have available magistrate judges to handle discovery issues without the logjam of the docket congestion of the district judge. But although Judge Cannon has refused to use her magistrate judge on any of these matters, she's done all of it herself. But if you have a new judge with less congested docket using the magistrate, definitely this could be a trial and a verdict by January of 2025.
Your best guess is that within a month, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals over Judge Cannon's court could, first of all, overrule her and remove her from the case. And
Correct.
the removal is not appealable?
Trump's people could try to appeal that removal, but up to this U.S. Supreme Court. But I don't know of any Supreme Court decision that ever has accepted review of what's the error, removing someone that's so biased. That seems to me so improbable that's not even worth contemplating. If it's Trump's people who say we want her there, it says, yeah, that's the reason why she was removed. She's biased in your favor. Of course you're going to want her. So I don't think that's likely to get beyond the 11th Circuit and won't go anyplace.
Well, as we've said before in many a statement, Bruce, with you and me, he's a serial law violator and a violator of the Constitution. Not that past presidents haven't violated federal laws or the Constitution, going into wars against countries unconstitutionally, but he's taken it, number one, to a new level of offenses, and he's proud of it. He brags about it. Unlike Nixon, he doesn't curl himself up in the corner and try to double talk it. And in the process, he's destroying the rule of law and the norms that are the foundation for the rule of law and getting massive press coverage. Well, we're out of time. Thank you very much, Bruce Fein, as usual.
Thanks, Ralph.
We've been speaking with Bruce Fein. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com.
Stand up, stand up.
Federal regulators have for the first time banned a digital platform from serving users under 18. Let's find out how that all went down with our next guest. David?
Haley Hinkle is policy counsel at Fairplay, where she advocates for laws and regulations that protect children and teens' autonomy and safety online. Ms. Hinkle has also worked on issues at the intersection of government surveillance technology and civil liberties. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Haley Hinkle.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yeah, welcome, Haley. This is a subject of Silicon Valley's electronic child molesters damaging the physical and mental health of youngsters and exploiting them mercilessly for their personal data, which these companies then sell to advertisers and make tons of money. And nothing seems to stop this roller coaster coming out of Silicon Valley. So here we have your group, which has worked with the Federal Trade Commission. Your group is called Fairplay. We can give the website later. And they've been working with the Federal Trade Commission to concentrate on one really odious, disgusting app by a company called NGL, which is shorthand for Not Gonna Lie. So tell us about this case and give us a flavor of what license anonymity allows here.
Absolutely. Yeah, Fairplay worked with social media reform advocate and survivor parent Kristen Bride to bring this complaint to the FTC about NGL. And really, what we were doing was targeting just one example of a type of platform that we see pop up over and over again and then sort of fail for reasons I'll explain, and then a new one crops up. And the reason we worked with Kristen Bride is because her son was cyberbullied on similar predecessors to NGL and died by suicide after experiencing just extended vicious cyberbullying. But what NGL and others like it, YOLO, LMK, what they do is they sort of incentivize for young people posting on their social media accounts some kind of link or inbox. In the case of NGL, it's a link to your NGL mailbox to solicit anonymous messages from your peers. On NGL, they were encouraging users to post on X, formerly known as Twitter, on Instagram, and on Snapchat. And what we have seen over the last couple of decades of the internet with these types of anonymous platforms that encourage either anonymous messaging within your peer group or within a specific geographic area, Yik Yak, for example, and newer platform Fizz are targeted more around school campuses, is that encouraging minors to talk about and to each other anonymously within a limited community always leads to really horrific cyberbullying outcomes, because anonymity empowers people, to say things they wouldn't normally, and maybe in some adult context, that's fine. But for young people, when they know it's someone they know, when it's happening within their community, within their followers, that was very much, Krista would tell you, part of Carson Bride's story. He knew, he was posting this on his Snapchat. He knew it was people he knew that were sending these horrible messages, but not who the senders were. That really has very acute negative effects for teenagers and children. NGL was really marketing itself, particularly on Instagram and I think a little bit on TikTok, as an opportunity to find out about crushes, find out about, people who have been admiring you, talk about parents, teachers, really appealing to young people who are in school. And then to sort of top it off, what we really highlighted in our complaint is that they were offering a paid premium subscription service if you wanted to find out who had been sending these messages. They would sort of pose on their ads and things that, well, haha, if someone sends me a message, they don't know I can pay for premium and find out who they are. But once a user went through the App Store and paid for that subscription, the hints they got were completely useless. It would give a very general geographic area, allegedly whether it was an Android or iPhone device. There was some kind of NGL user ID that meant, nothing to anyone other than the company. And so they were inducing kids to sign up for this subscription, which I believe was a weekly subscription, though that was not necessarily clear, certainly to a child. When you go to sign up, you're just looking for answers. And so we brought this to the commission in order to highlight, one, the issues around the anonymous peer messaging tools, where we're really not seeing redeemable value. Places where we see that anonymity is a positive in other parts of society, we're not seeing that in these cases. And then two, the financial harm on top of that, the inducing kids to turn over money in order to try to figure out what's going on. At the end of the day, they're not going to get any information about who might be harassing them or bullying them.
All right, let's try to overcome some anonymity here as well. This company that was gone after by the Federal Trade Commission calls itself NGL. And who are the executives running it, and who's the law firm that represented them before the Federal Trade Commission proceeding?
The two executives running it that were named in the complaint and as a sort of co-defendants with the company are Raj Veer and Jao Figueredo, and they were represented by Latham and Watkins.
And Latham and Watkins is one of the giant law firms with well over 1,000 lawyers representing corporations. What was the decision that NGL agreed to observe that the FTC laid on them?
There were a few key parts of the settlement agreement with NGL and the FTC. One was that they needed to come into COPPA compliance. The Children's Online Privacy Protection Act has certain protections for children under 13. Their parents need to consent before data collection. So that indicates to us that the FTC believes there were under 13-year-olds on the platform. I believe the co-founders have contested that a bit in their statements after, but it would make absolute sense based on their marketing. So they need to comply with COPPA. When they know they have under 13, they need to get parental consent before the child uses it as an overall concept. Another big piece of the FTC's action here was that the app's business practices were unfair and deceptive under the FTC's Section 5 Unfair and Deceptive Acts and Practices Authority, not just for preteens, but for teenagers as well. And so the FTC and NGL agreed that NGL would not let anyone under 18, any minor, onto the platform, that they would implement an age gate at sign up, and that they would delete the data from anyone that they now knew to be under 18, and they won't let under 18s on there at all. And that's really significant because that represents a bit of a trend we're seeing with the FTC towards protecting teenagers with their Section 5 authority, in addition to what they've got to protect preteens. There were also some pieces in the settlement around their subscription model, the sign up. They were found in violation of some of the rules around what you need to communicate to consumers and what you need to provide for cancellation, because it was a weekly subscription sign up, and that was not, the FTC found that was not evident to the users.
And how much did they have to pay?
$5 million total. I believe $500,000 went to the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office, which helped bring this case alongside the FTC, and then $4.5 million will be collected to go back to consumers who had issues, again, with that subscription model and ended up paying for subscriptions when they did not mean to or know what they were doing.
And who's going to administer the release of that $4.5 million?
That'll be the FTC.
What is the big view of Fairplay? You know that you're just splashing here and there, trying to make a point, given the overwhelming power of these corporations, even in Congress, where the Republicans and Democrats have denounced them at hearings repeatedly, but somehow they can never get any legislation through over the last 15 years. Give me your preferred scenario of legal accountability for these electronic child molesters. What would you like the rule of law to be like, and how accessible would it be to the victims under your scenario?
Absolutely. We have been working the past couple of years on really a couple of things that we think are key to trying to address the system of incredible power that big tech has. One is expanding data privacy to all minors. Right now, as I said, we only have protections for preteens under the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. We've really got to protect all young people because that data is what is so appealing to platforms. It has so much value in terms of advertising and refining the platforms, whether it's a game, a social media app, what have you, to keep kids coming back, spending their time there. And then the other piece is really trying to shift some responsibility onto tech itself for considering specific issues and harms and specific safeguards and tools that will help make kids and teens more safe and help their parents understand that there are certain default protections in place. And that's where we've really been advocating for the Kids Online Safety Act to try to shift responsibility onto the platforms to consider specific harms and the duty of care, which I can talk about, but really forcing them to think about it at the point of product design rather than trying to address these things after the fact. And these are solutions that, this would be enforced by attorneys general, the Federal Trade Commission. So we're not talking here about something that gives private citizens additional causes of action. At this point, we are talking about state and federal regulators.
We've been talking with Haley Hinkle, a chief lawyer for the principal civic group in this area, Fairplay, which is out of Boston, and which has groups around the country trying to arouse the public against what's going on here by the wardens of the internet gulag. Steve?
Haley, this is a technical question. How do these apps know how old somebody is? How do they know that they're too young? And how do they know when they're too old? How do they know adults aren't anonymously posting on this to children?
That's a great question. What we know about a lot of these platforms, particularly the largest ones, Meta, for example, and Google, is that they are marshaling so much data in order to surveil all of us, but including children and teenagers, and target them with content and ads, that they are analyzing all of that information to estimate a user's age. And we know this in part because the platforms and the ad systems that support them will brag about it to advertisers. They will brag about their ability to target users with precision. In terms of some of the issues we've been facing around holding platforms responsible for that information, a lot of the times what they will do is ask for age at sign up and then turn a blind eye for compliance purposes to any other indicator. But there are many data points, the language a person uses, even down to sort of almost biometric information like keystrokes and the way a user types and navigates on an app can be indicators for a platform of user age. And so we really need to hold them responsible for all of that they're using for profit and advertising in order to target us all with content and ads in the compliance context as well.
Hannah?
Haley, I have a question about enforcement. So the two CEOs who were cited in the complaint and who were cited in the ultimate decision, are there any restrictions on their ability to start new companies? Any companies they start have any inherit any restrictions? Felonies follow people around for a lifetime. Misdemeanors can too. Does this regulatory ruling follow these CEOs around? Part of my question is, regulation as a form of deterrence. I mean, does this kind of burn them in their chosen career, or is it pretty easy to shake off something like this?
Yeah, that's a great question. The agreed order between the parties does say that the defendants, which is NGL, but also those two officers that have been named in the action, are barred from offering or promoting anonymous messaging to minors, period. And so, yes, it certainly does have an influence on this, what I would call, frankly, a get-rich-quick scheme that they crafted in order to trick young people into using their product. And, I think we talk a lot in this space, and we've talked today a bit about these companies. They get fined a bit, and it's the cost of doing business to them. But it's pieces like that that really help ensure that we don't see folks turning around and just doing the exact same thing under a different umbrella.
We've been talking with Haley Hinkle, Fairplay's policy counsel. Haley, before we close, tell us a little bit about Fairplay, who started it, what it's doing beyond the FTC story that we just discussed, and give slowly their website.
Absolutely. Fairplay is a nonprofit focused on the ways in which big tech's business model is at odds with the healthy development and well-being of children and teenagers. We have actually been around for over 25 years now under a couple of different names, most recently Campaign for a Commercial-Free Childhood. We were founded by Dr. Susan Lin, and our roots are really in addressing the ways in which marketing and advertising is at odds with what's best for kids and teens, and replacing the decisions of people who love and care for them, like their parents, their family members, their educators, their doctors. And so looking at sort of the heart of the business model of these things is really core to our work over the decades. You can find out more about us and our work that we do. We have an action network, the Screen Time Action Network at Fairplay, where professionals and families gather to discuss different issues around technology. You can find out more about us on our website at fairplayforkids.org.
Thank you very much, Haley Hinkle, and the efforts of Fairplay to protect children in this country from the ravages and avarice of rampaging corporatism. Thank you very much, Haley.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
We've been speaking with Haley Hinkle. We will link to Fairplay at ralphnaderradiohour.com. Up next, the nation's John Nichols joins us to talk about the state of journalism in Gaza and the state of the Democratic Party as it heads into its convention next month. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, July 19, 2024. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Neil Barofsky, the federally appointed monitor overseeing the United Auto Workers, is ratcheting up his conflict with UAW President Shawn Fein, announcing another investigation into the union leader who rose to national prominence amid the successful stand-up strike against the big three automakers. Yet newly unveiled documents suggest that Barofsky's pursuit of Fein has less to do with concerns over union self-dealing and more to do with the politics of Israel-Palestine. That's according to a report from Dropsite News. On December 1, the UAW became the largest union in the United States to officially call for a ceasefire. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Hannah and the rest of the team, and of course, Ralph. To close today's program, our next guest is here to tell us about how important it is to have on-the-ground journalists in Gaza and his efforts to make that happen. David?
John Nichols is a national affairs correspondent for The Nation and associate editor of the Capital Times. He has written, co-written, or edited over a dozen books on topics ranging from histories of American socialism and the Democratic Party to analysis of U.S. and global media systems. His latest, co-written with Senator Bernie Sanders, is the New York Times bestseller, It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism. He comes to us today from Milwaukee, where he's covering the Republican National Convention. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, John Nichols.
It is always an honor to be on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Thank you very much, John. We will get to your observations on the Republican National Convention. But the big news that we want to bring to our listeners was finally major media organizations all over the world, including the New York Times, Washington Post, the BBC, Agence France Presse, CNN, The Guardian, and many other leading media groups from countries around the world have signed a letter which starts out this way, quote, "We, the undersigned, request that Israeli authorities end immediately the restrictions on foreign media entering Gaza and grant independent access to international news organizations seeking to access the territory, and the exclusion of Israeli and all other journalists from Gaza has been going on for years under Netanyahu, long before October 7th. And so the devastation and the embargoes and the restriction of food and medicine before October 7th remained in quasi-darkness here. And this is really extraordinary for any country to be able to do that to an area that's not part of its country. Let's have your assessment of this. What took so long, and is it going to really have an impact?
Well, those are two very good questions, Ralph. And the first question, what took so long, is probably answered best by a broader observation that what has taken so long for international media in general to pay attention to the circumstance in Gaza, right? Not just to talk about reporting from on the ground, but really to give it the priority, to give it the seriousness that it has long deserved for generations. And so this is part of a much deeper problem, part of a much deeper challenge. And obviously, the recent events, particularly since October 7th, and even more so just in recent months, the last couple of months, I think have caused media organizations to, frankly, feel a measure of shame for their failure to cover up to this point, their failure to take it seriously, and frankly, their failure to fight, to be in a position to give the coverage that's needed. So they're stepping up now, and it took way too long, but it is important. It is absolutely vital that they are saying what they're saying. And certainly this letter will have influence and draw notice around the world. But the greater challenge remains, and that is the question of whether journalists will be given the opportunity and have the opening to provide the coverage that's needed in Gaza. At this point, by and large, the coverage from Gaza has come from Palestinian journalists, many of whom have been killed, as well as grassroots citizen journalists who've done their best to get information out. But it is absolutely vital to get top journalists from around the world into Gaza for two reasons. Number one, their reports are more likely to get picked up and used in major media outlets, on cable TV, on broadcast TV, et cetera, et cetera. And number two, their presence there, I think, does challenge the impunity with which military forces on the ground have treated journalists up to this point. Bringing in international journalists, I think, does help to stabilize things, one hopes. And let me give you one further observation, a final observation. When we look at situations like this, it's best to borrow from our history and recognize that we've had challenges like this before, not always with official barriers to coverage, but with ongoing long-term neglect. And one of the best examples comes in the United States. Back in the 1950s, media outlets that had not done a good job of covering circumstances in the segregated Jim Crow South in the late 50s and early 1960s started to cover things. They started to send top journalists like David Halberstam and others into the South. When they did, things started to move a lot more quickly because people around the country began to see the reality of what was going on there. And so simply getting journalists there and turning the cameras on can have a real impact. It can highlight the struggles of people on the ground. It can highlight the fact that people are trying to make a change. But when those efforts of people to try and make a change be they in Gaza or any other place around the world, if they're uncovered, they're so much more difficult.
Well, you alluded to killing some of the Palestinian journalists by the Israeli military. Actually, they've systematically hunted them down, including killing their families. And they've killed over 150 of these courageous journalists who are the principal source of information about the Israeli genocide in Gaza. So whatever you can do, John Nichols, and you have great contacts in journalism. You've put on great conferences with Professor McChesney in the past on the media and how it's being corporatized and censored. Whatever you do to spread this pressure to stop the guided tours once in a while where they bring a few journalists, the Israeli military, to put them in armed vehicles and give them a 2 or 3 hour guided tour so they could smell the devastation and take some pictures. That is what infuriated a lot of these media organizations who signed this letter that we're talking about. Let's go to an article related that you wrote, John Nichols, in the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's called Joe Biden Should Listen to Wisconsin Democrats on Gaza. Can you explain that?
Sure. And thanks for all your good insights as regards the importance of highlighting this letter and highlighting some of the other things that have come out. I have written a lot for The Nation, Cap Times, other publications about this specific challenge as regards journalistic coverage of what's happening in Gaza, recognizing the heroism of the Gazans and the Palestinians who are on the ground doing coverage, also detailing the death toll, which is horrific for all humanity there, but also especially for journalists and their families. So we've done a lot, but it still hasn't broken through in the way that it has to. And the answer is that will only break through when you have journalists on the ground there on a daily basis, living there, or at least being physically present in a fundamental way, in an ongoing way. So what you're highlighting here is really important, and I'll continue to highlight
it's not, by the way, it's not only the death toll, as you know. Doctors who've come back from Gaza have told us that just about everybody in Gaza is sick, injured, or both.
The mental health issues. I mean, imagine living in this circumstance for this amount of time. It's overwhelming. So agreed totally on that point. Now let's pop on to the question that you asked, which was an important one. The article you're mentioning, which I have written in a number of forums and in a number of settings over the last few months, reporting not just on Wisconsin, but on Michigan and on a number of other states where they have had uncommitted delegate groups run, trying to highlight what's going on in Gaza within the Democratic primary process. And I know you've talked about this some, but basically here's what happened. Joe Biden had a kind of overwhelming advantage as the sitting president going into the Democratic primary process. He had a couple of opponents, Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson, but frankly, they didn't get far, and both of them kind of withdrew their candidacies or stood down pretty early on. At that point, it looked like Biden had a kind of a clear walk to the nomination. And frankly, he's done very, very well as a candidate in primaries. He's gotten good totals. But a group of activists in Michigan decided that they wanted to register their opposition to Biden's approach to Gaza. And they had a breakthrough success in Michigan. They got, a substantial portion of the vote, well over 10%. And that's a big deal in a Democratic primary with an incumbent president. They actually won a couple delegates. Then in other states, you saw the numbers even go up dramatically more. They won a lot of delegates up in Minnesota. They won a substantial number of delegates in Hawaii. In the state of Wisconsin, one of many states where you had an uncommitted campaign, you had literally tens of thousands of people going out to cast their ballot for this uncommitted option, which usually doesn't get many votes at all. And what's significant about it, I think it operates on a couple of levels. First and foremost, it's the votes themselves and the delegates. It's worth noting that there will be delegates to the Democratic National Convention, dozens of them, who are there as uncommitted delegates seeking to deliver the message that the Democratic Party and that Joe Biden need to change their stance on Gaza. But beneath that delegate number, and frankly, the hope that there would be a platform debate, some sort of real dialogue at the Democratic Convention, beneath that is also the data on where those votes came from. In Michigan, a big deal was made of noting that there's a large vote in Muslim American and Palestinian American communities, same in New Jersey and other states with large populations. On top of that, though, it's very important to note that some of the highest votes around the country for uncommitted came in student districts, areas around campuses of of big universities. In fact, the vote for uncommitted in Michigan, in counties with the University of Michigan, Eastern Michigan University, places like that, it was as high as in counties with large Muslim American populations. So what you see is a tremendous number of students, young people, coming out and saying, we want a different policy. Same thing happened in Madison. In fact, there were some precincts in Madison, at least one, where the uncommitted vote actually matched that of the vote for Joe Biden. So, I mean, it was a very, very strong signal. Why that matters is because Biden's already in trouble. He's got a rough reelect as it is. There's no question of that. And in the last three major election cycles, in 2018, 2020, and 2022, the votes of young people, particularly college students, were absolutely critical to putting Democrats over the top. So when I say that Joe Biden and others need to listen to Wisconsin and other states where there's been a large vote for these uncommitted slates coming from student districts, from Palestinian American districts, from Arab American districts, from progressive districts, it's practical politics. It isn't just morality, although that's a pretty good reason to listen. But it's practical politics. If they don't pay attention to this, they run a real risk of having a depressed turnout. I don't think many of those folks are going to go vote for Donald Trump. I think what they're going to do in some cases, sadly, is just not vote. And frankly, Democrats, Biden can't afford to lose those votes.
But, just broadening it out, what you're saying, John Nichols, the Wisconsin Democrats, through demonstrations, votes, and now a formally adopted party platform plank for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. It's in the platform. And in your article, you say the Democratic Party of Wisconsin, not the only state party to have passed a pro-ceasefire resolution. Parties in Texas, Hawaii, New Mexico, Washington State have done so too. But the unique circumstance of Wisconsin as a key battleground state makes the resolution that Democrats passed over the weekend particularly significant, end quote. Well, what we're seeing here is going to be a battle royal on this issue at the Democratic National Convention in August in Chicago, correct?
We hope, but we don't know. And this is the very challenging reality. In fact, I have a big piece going up on the nation's website, probably today or tomorrow morning. In fact, talked about on Amy Goodman's show just today. There is an effort by the Biden administration and by the Democratic National Committee to constrain the convention, to make it less of a normal convention and more of one that is stage managed. There is a proposal now to hold the roll call vote for president, not on the convention floor, but to do it weeks earlier in a so-called virtual roll call. That would be effectively a Zoom meeting or a conference call rather than an actual traditional roll call. That's obviously an effort to do two things. Number one, to hold the roll call early so that you can lock in Biden's nomination at a point when many people are questioning whether he should be the nominee for a whole bunch of reasons. And two, I think to limit or undermine the amount of coverage, the amount of attention to issues of concern such as Gaza. And my fear, Ralph, is that in this process of sort of dumbing things down, of diminishing what's going on, there is a very real chance that efforts to have a platform debate, efforts to have any sort of realistic discussion will just be canceled out, that you'll effectively turn the convention into what we have seen too much of already, which is a stage-managed, produced press conference, right? An attempt to create an image rather than to have any sort of discourse, any sort of dialogue. So I think there's a real challenge there. I don't think we have a guarantee that we're going to have the debate, the dialogue, the discourse that we should. And I think this is something that should concern everyone. This is about more than just the issue of Gaza, although Gaza is very central to it. This is about all the issues. The Democratic Party in particular does not benefit from having a shut down, closed down, narrow, stage-managed process. In fact, historically, the Democratic Party has benefited most when it's opened up its process, as it did in 1948, when they allowed a debate on civil rights, and that debate led to a civil rights plank, one that Harry Truman himself didn't really want, but that plank was almost certainly essential to his reelection to the presidency that year. Joe Biden ought to take a lesson from the past and recognize that having a more open convention, having one where there can be real dialogue, would ultimately be beneficial to him, especially if he listened to the people that were telling him to adopt a different position.
Well, if they're going to proceed this way and snuff out any kind of discussion at the convention, they're just going to alienate more of their supporters to stay home or vote for third-party candidates like Jill Stein of the Green Party. I mean, it's spectacularly stupid from a strategic point of view. Don't they understand that they can lose an election just by having people stay home?
Ralph, I think that the questions you're asking are very appropriate. And it is, you mentioned Jill Stein, there's also Cornel West, there's other people running who have, even the Libertarian candidate, who have raised real concerns about what's going on with U.S. foreign policy. And so I do think that combination of having third-party candidates who could potentially, get votes that the Democrats might want, that's one thing. But you're right about the stay home factor. That's really the critical thing. If there is a depressed turnout among Democratic voters, that's going to do tremendous damage to Joe Biden's prospects, but also the prospects of Democrats running for the House and Senate. I mean, the overall damage could be, catastrophic. And I think you ask, don't they understand that? The answer to the question is, I think they do understand, but I think that they are now so lost in for lack of a better term, an effort to kind of follow the path that they got on initially, right? To just go forward doing what they have planned to do from the start and not to let any information or any insight cause them to shift. And that's one of the most dangerous things you ever see in politics. I can tell you that I've seen it before, and so have you. When Jimmy Carter in 1980 presumed that people wouldn't accept Ronald Reagan, that ultimately people were going to vote for Carter to reelect him as president, they miscalculated terribly, and Carter lost. In fact, he lost quite badly. But there was something else that happened that was profound. So, too, did many of the most prominent progressive Democratic senators. And so it wasn't just a loss for Carter. It was a loss for the Democratic Party and, frankly, for its ability to stand up to Reagan, to stand up for economic and social and racial justice and all their goals, and so, or all their best goals. And so you ended up in a situation where neglect of political realities, neglect of the challenges that they were facing, ultimately caused the Democratic Party to lose massive amounts of ground. And some of that damage lingers with us to this day. And so this is a big deal. Democrats should be thinking very, very seriously about whether they want to have an open convention or a closed convention. And frankly, if they go with a closed convention, if they stage manage things and don't accept the dialogue, don't accept the discourse that frankly is necessary at this point, not just on the issues, but even on the question of the nomination itself. If they don't do that, I think the dangers are A, obvious, and B, potentially profound.
Well, one of the reasons, in addition to his performance on the debate with Trump, so many leading Democrats asked him to step aside is because they saw the whole ticket crumbling all the way down to the local elections around the country, not just Congress, but state legislatures, governorships, city councils, just collapsing. And that's still a very great concern by them. Let's turn, in the few minutes we have left, to the Republican National Convention, where the head of the Teamsters delivered a pretty gutsy 17-minute speech. He didn't pander to them at all, focusing on the ravages of corporate power against labor in the United States. On the Amy Goodman show, I heard that hard plastic water bottles are banned from being brought into the convention. But outside the convention, people can walk around with guns because Wisconsin law allows that. And after what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, the cry for gun safety reform is very, very minimal these days all over the country. So what's it gonna take, John Nichols, to put some of these safeguards that we have seen be very successful in Canada and Western Europe, as well as the ban that expired on the AR-15 some years ago and was not renewed by Congress? What's your scenario here?
Well, look, in the past, when we had horrible shootings, be it actual killings or assassination attempts, there was a national reaction, a bipartisan reaction. People recognized that there were problems, right? There were challenges to controlling guns. And so we did it after Bobby Kennedy was shot in 1968. Significant gun control legislation was passed. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen anymore in America because one party, the Republican Party, has largely committed to a no gun control stance. It's very militant on it. And unfortunately, the Democrats, who've gotten better on the issue, have still tended to be pretty weak on it. And they were very weak on it for a number of years. And so we're in a bad situation on this. There's no question. And one of the things that the Republican National Convention circumstance highlights is just how bad it is. It's important to understand that the reason that Milwaukee, a city with progressive governance, with good people in charge who want to have safe streets, want to protect their people, the reason that Milwaukee can't do this is because of something you know about, and that's called preemption. In Milwaukee, the local officials are preempted. They are not allowed to enact gun control legislation. As a result, they are stuck with the state law. The state law is very, very pro-gun, for lack of a better term. And so even as this convention was coming, even as they were looking at a circumstance where it was clearly necessary, clearly a good idea to establish some protections, say you can't have guns in the neighborhoods around the convention. You can't threaten people, even if you don't use those guns. Just simply, there's certain places where you want to have some constraints, and that's just logic. They were barred from doing so. And even more recently, just in the last couple of weeks, after the assassination attempt on President Trump, Governor Tony Evers, the Democratic governor of Wisconsin, asked for a waiver, for some sort of permission, some sort of ability to put some smart gun control protections in place around the convention. He was barred from doing so. He was not allowed to do so because this state statute preempts officials who are elected by the people from protecting the people.
Steve?
John, say there's an open convention and it's a Kamala Harris, it's a Gavin Newsom, it's a J.B. Pritzker. What are the chances they're going to change their stance on Biden's stance on Gaza?
I think if the Democrats went to an open convention and if they chose a new nominee, that nominee would be freed in some senses to, at the very least, take a more nuanced stand as regards Gaza and perhaps even really move on the issue. I've interviewed a number of these people. I think that there are many of them who are open to not necessarily going to a place where Ralph Nader's at or where a lot of activists are at, but to a much more thoughtful place as regards what you want to do in Gaza, in more broadly in the Middle East. And so I think there could be a little bit of opening up. I think it could be relevant. There's been note made of the fact that Kamala Harris, who would clearly be the front runner to replace Biden, there's been note made of the fact that she has in several circumstances said things that were seen as more sympathetic, frankly, to the circumstance of Gazans than President Biden. She hasn't gone anywhere near where I think activists would like her to go. She hasn't gone as far as I would like to see her go. But I do think the shift could have an impact on the issue. And that's, I guess, one of the bottom line realities. What you want is a process where the passion of the people on this issue can be heard. And if Joe Biden hears it and changes his stance, that's democracy at work. That's a good thing. If Joe Biden doesn't hear it, but is replaced by somebody who does, again, that's democracy at work. To make this system in this country functional, you have to have an ability for the people to cry out for a change in policy and for that cry to be heard and acted upon. If that doesn't happen, then you run the risk of ending up in a circumstance very much like 1968, where Lyndon Johnson handed off the presidency, right? He did not run for re-election. He gave it to Hubert Humphrey as vice president, but Humphrey did not change enough on the issue of Vietnam to win that election. And so even with a new candidate, you run the risk of ending up in that situation. But there is at least, I think many people would suggest to you, there's the possibility that with a different candidate, you might have at least some evolution of the stance. Bottom line, though, is whether it's Biden or whether it's somebody else, the stance should change because the United States should be far more active in trying to save the lives of innocent people on the ground in Gaza.
The Democratic Party has always had a difficulty of listening to anybody outside the Democratic Party, including progressive citizen groups all over the country. We tried to remedy that, as you know, John Nichols, in 2022 with our effort called winningamerica.net to get into greater detail on the kind of policy issues and strategies that are being ignored.
Well, indeed, there's been a lot of work on this, and you've done tremendous work for a very long time. I just hate to tell you, our work is not done on the issues of how media covers the Middle East, how media covers Gaza, how politicians respond to it, how political parties respond. This is a very challenging time. And frankly, it is a time where we need the Ralph Nader radio show and lots of other media outlets to speak up about the need for economic and social and racial justice, and frankly, for a foreign policy that is focused on humanity and saving lives rather than militarism and, this geopolitical strategies that often serve no one well, not people in Israel or people in Palestine.
Otherwise known as the American Empire. Thank you very much. We've been talking with John Nichols, who writes prominently for the Capital Times in Madison, Wisconsin, and is the political editor for The Nation magazine. We look forward to your dispatches on the remaining days of the Republican National Convention and your coverage of the Democratic National Convention in August in Chicago, Illinois. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, Ralph. And I apologize for background noise here. I'm actually talking to you from just outside the convention hall. So at the very least, you're getting a real live from the belly of the beast report. And I hope to continue to do that. Maybe we could talk during the Democratic convention as well. I'm going to take off. I love you. Keep strong. Carry on the good work you do.
We've been speaking with John Nichols. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. I want to thank our guests again, Bruce Fein, Haley Hinkle, and John Nichols. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with In Case You Haven't Heard. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel, and for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. We have a new issue of the Capitol Hill Citizen. It's out now, and to order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreaders, Elizabeth Solomon. Our social media manager, Stephen Wendt.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, and I hope you'll read my new book, Out of the Darkness, collection of columns over the years that are very pressingly relevant in today's political and economic climate. And if you have any comment you want to send to President Biden, you can go to the White House switchboard, 202-456-1111. That's 202-456-1111. And they actually tabulate opinions on different issues. It's important that you express your voice at the top level in Washington.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up. Rise up, I know you